I'm Anne, 57 years old, and I'll never forget standing in my daughter's childhood bedroom, watching her adjust her wedding veil for the third time. Sarah looked absolutely radiant, but something in my chest felt heavy that morning. Maybe it was just normal mother anxiety, or maybe it was the $43 million secret I'd been carrying for 3 years. As I helped zip up her dress, I wondered if keeping quiet about Uncle Robert's inheritance was the right choice. Little did I know this wedding would reveal everything I needed to know about the people I thought I could trust most. Before I share what happened next, let me know where you're watching from. Please hit like and subscribe. You won't believe how this wedding changed everything I thought I knew about my own daughter. Looking back now, I realize the signs were always there. But grief has a way of clouding judgment. My husband David passed away from a sudden heart attack 5 years ago, leaving me to navigate life alone in our small Oregon town. I'd worked at the public library for over 2 decades, finding comfort in the quiet routine of organizing books and helping neighbors find their next great read. My salary wasn't much, but it was enough for my simple lifestyle. Sarah had always been my pride and joy. At 28, she was everything I'd hoped she'd become: smart, independent, working as a marketing coordinator in Portland. We talked every week, sometimes every day. She'd drive the 2 hours home to visit at least twice a month, and I treasured those weekends together. Our relationship felt genuine, built on shared memories, inside jokes, and unconditional love. Or so I thought. When Sarah first introduced me to Marcus 6 months before their wedding, I wanted so badly to like him. He was 32, worked as an investment advisor, and seemed to genuinely care for my daughter. Marcus was polite, well-dressed, and always brought flowers when he visited. He'd compliment my cooking, ask about my work at the library, and seemed interested in our family history. But there were small things that made me uncomfortable, questions that felt too personal for someone I barely knew. During their third visit, Marcus casually asked about my retirement plans. Did I have a good pension? Had I received any inheritance when David died? What about other family members? I brushed off these questions, assuming he was just making conversation, or perhaps worried about Sarah's financial security. But the questions kept coming, visit after visit, always wrapped in concern for my well-being. What Marcus didn't know, what nobody knew except my lawyer and banker, was that 3 years earlier my brother Robert had died in a car accident. Robert had been 8 years older than me, brilliant with technology, and had built a successful startup that he'd sold just months before his death. He'd never married, had no children, and left everything to me. $43 million. The number still made me dizzy when I thought about it. I'd made a conscious decision to keep this inheritance secret. I'd watched too many families torn apart by money, seen friendships destroyed when sudden wealth entered the picture. I wanted to know that people loved me for who I was, not what I had. So I continued living on my librarian's salary, tucking the inheritance money away in carefully managed investments, taking out only small amounts to cover unexpected expenses. When Sarah announced her engagement to Marcus, I was thrilled for her happiness, but worried about his constant financial curiosity. Still, I pushed my concerns aside. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe he was just practical, thinking about their future together. The wedding planning process revealed more red flags. Sarah and Marcus had budgeted $15,000 for their ceremony and reception, a modest amount that seemed to stress them both. I offered to help with costs, explaining I'd been saving for this day since Sarah was born. In truth, $15,000 was pocket change compared to my real net worth. But I maintained the illusion that this represented a significant portion of my life savings. Marcus seemed relieved by my contribution, but also probing. He asked detailed questions about my savings account, wondered aloud how I'd managed to save so much on a librarian's salary, and even suggested I might want to invest my remaining money more aggressively. He offered to help manage my finances, calling it a family service, now that he was going to be my son-in-law. The more Marcus pushed, the more protective I became of my secret. I started giving vague answers about my finances, claiming I'd rather not discuss money matters. This seemed to frustrate him, though he hid it well behind his charming smile. 3 weeks before the wedding, Sarah called me crying. She'd had a fight with Marcus about wedding expenses, and during our conversation she mentioned something that chilled me to the bone. She said Marcus had been asking her about Uncle Robert, wondering what kind of estate he might have left behind. Sarah didn't know the details of Robert's will. I'd never shared that information with anyone, but apparently she'd mentioned to Marcus that Robert had been successful in business. I realized then that Marcus wasn't just curious about my financial situation, he was actively investigating it. But I still held on to hope that I was wrong, that maybe his questions came from genuine concern rather than greed. I wanted to believe in the man my daughter loved, wanted to trust that their marriage was built on something real. The night before the wedding, I lay awake wondering if I should tell Sarah the truth about the inheritance. Part of me thought it might be a wonderful wedding surprise, a way to ensure their financial security and my daughter's happiness. But something in my gut told me to wait to observe, to learn more about who Marcus really was when he thought money might be involved. I had no idea how right my instincts were, or how grateful I'd later be for keeping that secret locked away. Sarah's wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, one of those perfect September mornings that made Oregon look like paradise. I spent the early hours helping my daughter prepare, watching her transform from my little girl into a radiant bride. Her happiness was infectious, and for those precious morning hours, all my worries about Marcus seemed foolish and overprotective. The ceremony took place in the garden behind the historic inn, where David and I had celebrated our own 10th anniversary. Sarah walked down the aisle with such confidence and joy, and when she reached Marcus at the altar, the look they shared seemed genuinely loving. I found myself wiping away tears, wondering if I'd been wrong about Marcus all along. His wedding vows were beautiful, speaking about partnership, trust, and building a life together based on honesty and mutual respect. The irony of those words wouldn't hit me until later. Sarah's vows were heartfelt, talking about finding her best friend and soulmate, someone who accepted her completely and made her want to be the best version of herself. During the reception, I had the chance to spend more time with Marcus's family. His parents, Dr. James and Linda, were lovely people. Dr. James had recently retired from his surgery practice, and Linda was a successful real estate broker. They were clearly well off, living in a beautiful home in an upscale Portland neighborhood, driving luxury cars and talking casually about recent trips to Europe. This made Marcus's obsession with my financial situation even more puzzling. If his family had money, why was he so interested in what a small-town librarian might have saved? Unless, of course, he suspected there was more to my story than I'd revealed. The reception was everything Sarah had dreamed of. The food was delicious, the music perfect, and the speeches heartfelt. I gave a toast about watching Sarah grow into the amazing woman she'd become, and Marcus spoke beautifully about how lucky he felt to join our small family. Everything seemed perfect, magical even. But then came the moment that changed everything. Near the end of the evening, I stepped outside for some fresh air and to call my sister in California, wanting to share details about the beautiful ceremony. The inn's garden had several quiet corners, and I found a bench near the rose bushes where I thought I'd have privacy for my phone call. I was just ending my conversation with my sister when I heard Marcus's voice from around the corner. He was on his own phone call, and something in his tone made me freeze rather than announce my presence. "Yeah, the wedding went great," Marcus was saying to whoever was on the other end. "Sarah looks beautiful, and her mum seems really pleased. The old lady is pretty simple. Just a librarian in a small town, you know." But Sarah mentioned something about an inheritance a while back. Some uncle who died and left money. I haven't gotten the details yet, but I'm planning to find out more after we get back from the honeymoon. He paused, listening to the other person. I know. I know it might not be much, but even 50 or 100,000 would help with the house down payment. And if it's more than that, well, Sarah's an only child, so eventually it'll all come to us anyway. Her mum's not getting any younger, you know. My blood ran cold. The casual way he dismissed me as the old lady, the calculating tone when he talked about inheritance money, the assumption that whatever I had would eventually belong to them. This wasn't the loving son-in-law who'd been so charming for the past 6 months. This was someone viewing me as a financial opportunity. I sat frozen on that bench, listening to Marcus laugh about something the other person said, my heart breaking for my daughter, who had no idea she'd just married someone who saw her family as a source of income rather than love. When Marcus finished his call and headed back inside, I remained in the garden for another 20 minutes trying to process what I'd heard. Maybe I'd misunderstood. Maybe he was just being practical about financial planning. Maybe every conversation sounds worse when you're only hearing one side. But deep down, I knew better. The way he'd talked about me, the dismissive tone, the casual assumption about inheritance money, it all painted a picture of someone very different from the man who'd charmed us all for months. I returned to the reception with a smile plastered on my face, hugging Sarah and Marcus goodbye as they left for their honeymoon in Hawaii. Sarah was glowing with happiness, chattering about their plans and how perfect everything had been. Marcus kissed my cheek and thanked me again for all my help with the wedding. His performance of the devoted son-in-law, flawless as always. As I watched them drive away, I made a decision. I would wait and see what happened when they returned. Maybe the phone call had been an anomaly. Maybe Marcus would prove me wrong. But I would be watching carefully now, and I would protect both my secret and my heart until I knew for certain what kind of man my daughter had married. The next 2 weeks, while Sarah and Marcus' honeymoon in Hawaii, gave me plenty of time to think. I threw myself into work at the library, but my mind kept returning to that overheard conversation. Had I been naive to hope that money wouldn't eventually become an issue? Was I wrong to keep the inheritance secret? Or was Marcus's behavior proving that my instincts had been right all along? By the time their plane landed back in Portland, I'd decided to trust my gut and keep watching. What I discovered in the weeks that followed would prove that sometimes the worst thing about people isn't that they disappoint you. It's that they exceed your worst expectations. When Sarah and Marcus returned from their Hawaiian honeymoon, I expected things to gradually return to our normal rhythm. Sarah would call every few days, they'd visit every other weekend, and we'd slowly settle into the new dynamic of having Marcus as part of our family. What I didn't expect was how quickly the mask would slip. The first sign came during Sarah's welcome home phone call. Instead of the usual excited chatter about their trip, the conversation felt different, more businesslike. After briefly describing their hotel and a few tourist activities, Sarah steered the conversation toward my finances with a directness that caught me off guard. "Mum, Marcus and I have been talking about your situation," she began, and something in her tone made me grip the phone tighter. "You've been living so modestly for so many years. Don't you have any real savings? What about Uncle Robert's estate? You never really told me what happened with all that." I tried to keep my voice casual, explaining that Robert had left me a modest amount that I was using for retirement planning. Nothing dramatic, just enough to supplement my pension when the time came. But Sarah wasn't satisfied with vague answers anymore. "Mum, be honest with me. We're family now, all 3 of us." Marcus thinks you might not be making the best financial decisions, keeping everything in basic savings accounts. He could help you invest properly, make your money work harder for you. The presumption took my breath away. Marcus, who'd known me for less than a year, apparently felt qualified to judge my financial decisions. More troubling was that Sarah seemed to have bought into his assessment completely. Over the next few weeks, their visits became more frequent and more focused. They'd arrive with printouts about investment opportunities, articles about retirement planning, and increasingly direct questions about my assets. Marcus would make comments about how my house could be worth more if I made certain improvements, or how I could be earning better returns on my savings. The pressure was subtle, but constant. They'd express concern about my future worry, about what would happen if I had a medical emergency question, whether my current financial strategy was really adequate. It was all framed as love and concern, but it felt like interrogation. Things escalated 3 weeks after their return, when Marcus made an appointment to meet with me privately. He came to my house on a Saturday morning, armed with a briefcase full of financial planning materials and what he called a heart-to-heart conversation about my future. "Anne, I hope you don't mind me being direct," he began, settling himself at my kitchen table, as if he belonged there. "Sarah and I are concerned that you're not being entirely honest with us about your financial situation. We know Uncle Robert was successful, and we know he didn't have other family to leave money to. As your family now, we just want to make sure you're protected." Protected. The word felt loaded with implications. I maintained my story about modest inheritance and careful savings, but Marcus wasn't buying it. He pulled out papers showing what he claimed were typical estate values for successful business owners, pointing out that my lifestyle didn't match what I should be able to afford if I'd inherited significant money. "Either Uncle Robert left you more than you're saying," Marcus concluded, "or you're not managing the money properly. Either way, Sarah and I think it's time for some transparency and professional help." The conversation lasted over an hour with Marcus, becoming increasingly assertive about my need for his financial guidance. When I politely declined his offer to take over managing my investments, his friendly demeanor cracked slightly. "Anne, I'm going to be direct because I care about Sarah's future too," he said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "If something happened to you tomorrow, Sarah would inherit whatever you have. Doesn't she deserve to know what that means? Doesn't she deserve to have input into how her future inheritance is being managed?" Her future inheritance. There it was laid out in plain terms. Marcus wasn't concerned about my financial well-being. He was concerned about what would eventually belong to him and Sarah. After he left, I sat in my kitchen for a long time trying to process what had just happened. The man who'd charmed us all during the engagement and wedding had just essentially threatened me with transparency demands about money that wasn't his business. But the worst was yet to come. 2 days later, I received a call from my bank. A man claiming to be my son-in-law had contacted them saying he was helping me with financial planning and needed information about my accounts. The bank, properly following protocol, had refused to give him any information and wanted to alert me to the contact. Marcus had actually tried to access my banking information without my permission. That evening, Sarah called, and for the first time in 28 years, my daughter raised her voice at me in anger. "Mum, we're your family," she shouted into the phone. "Why are you being so secretive? We just want to help you. Marcus is a professional, he knows about these things, and you're acting like we're trying to steal from you or something." The accusation stung, because in a way that's exactly what I was beginning to suspect they were trying to do. "Sarah, honey, my finances are my private business," I tried to explain. "I appreciate the concern, but I'm perfectly capable of managing my own money." "Are you, though?" Sarah shot back. because from where we're sitting, it looks like you're either lying to us about what you have or you're making terrible decisions about how to handle it. Either way, we have a right to know what we're dealing with. We have a right to know. My own daughter was talking about my money as if it belonged to all of us, as if marriage to Marcus had given him some claim on assets he'd never earned. The call ended with Sarah hanging up on me, our first real fight since she'd been a teenager. I stared at the phone in my hand, wondering when my loving daughter had transformed into this stranger who felt entitled to my private financial information. But as painful as these revelations were, they were nothing compared to what I was about to discover about just how deep their deception ran and how far they were willing to go to get their hands on money they believed was rightfully theirs. The breaking point came 6 weeks after the wedding, during what Sarah described as a family emergency. She called me at 7 in the morning, crying so hard I could barely understand her words. "Mum, you have to help us," she sobbed into the phone. "Marcus was laid off yesterday. They're downsizing his entire department, and we're going to lose our apartment. We need help with rent money, or we'll be on the street by the end of the month." My maternal instincts kicked in immediately. Despite my growing suspicions about Marcus, the thought of my daughter facing homelessness triggered every protective impulse I had. I told Sarah to calm down, that we'd figure something out, and asked for details about their financial situation so I could understand how to best help. But something nagged at me, even as I promised to consider lending them money. Marcus's company was well known in Portland, successful and growing. It seemed unlikely they'd eliminate an entire department without warning, especially one that included experienced investment advisors. After hanging up with Sarah, I made a decision that felt sneaky but necessary. I called the main number for Marcus's company and asked to speak with him, claiming to be a potential client who'd been referred by a friend. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Williams is in meetings all day," the receptionist told me cheerfully. "Would you like me to schedule a consultation for later this week? He has some openings on Thursday afternoon." Marcus wasn't laid off. He was at work, taking appointments, conducting business as usual. My daughter had just lied to me about a financial emergency, or Marcus had lied to her, and she was unknowingly passing along false information. I spent the rest of that day wrestling with what to do. If Sarah knew the truth and had deliberately lied to manipulate money from me, it meant my daughter had changed into someone I didn't recognize. If Marcus had lied to Sarah to create a crisis he could use to pressure me for money, it meant my son-in-law was manipulating both of us. Either scenario was heartbreaking. That evening, I called Sarah back and told her I could loan them $5,000 to help with immediate expenses, but that I'd need time to arrange anything larger. I wanted to see how they'd react to a number that was helpful, but not life-changing. Sarah's response was immediate and telling. "5,000, Mum, that's not going to solve anything. We need at least 20,000 to really get back on our feet, and that's assuming Marcus finds another job quickly." $20,000. For a couple in their 20s and 30s, both working both from comfortable families, $20,000 was a huge amount to need as emergency funds. Unless, of course, you suspected the person you were asking had much more available and were testing to see how much you could extract. "Sarah, 5,000 is a significant amount of money for me," I said carefully. "I can't just pull 20,000 out of thin air." "But Mum, Uncle Robert's estate," Sarah pressed. "I know there was more than you've told me. You've been living the same way for years, never spending money on yourself, never traveling or buying anything nice. Where is all that inheritance money going?" The conversation continued for over an hour, with Sarah becoming increasingly frustrated by my refusal to admit to having more money. Finally, in exasperation, she said something that revealed just how much she and Marcus had been planning this approach. "Marcus says people like Uncle Robert, successful business owners, usually leave estates worth at least a few $1 million. He thinks you're sitting on serious money and just don't trust us enough to be honest about it, Marcus says. Everything came back to what Marcus thought, what Marcus believed, what Marcus had calculated about my financial situation. My daughter wasn't speaking from her own knowledge or instincts. She was parroting her husband's financial theories. 3 days later, they arrived at my house unannounced for what Marcus called a necessary family meeting. They brought legal documents they'd printed from the internet articles about estate law, and a proposal for what they called a family financial trust that would ensure proper management of my assets. The trust document, which they wanted me to sign, would have given Marcus power of attorney over my finances with Sarah as a secondary trustee. They presented it as protection for my future, a way to ensure professional management of my money and care for my needs as I aged. "Anne, we've done our research," Marcus said, with the confidence of someone who thought he held all the cards. "We know Robert's business was worth millions when he sold it. We know he had no other family. And we know you've been hiding the real amount from us, probably because you don't understand how to handle this much money." I looked at my daughter, hoping to see some recognition that this was wrong, that demanding access to my finances was inappropriate and hurtful. Instead, Sarah nodded along with Marcus's presentation, clearly convinced that they had both the right and the obligation to take control of money that belonged to me. "Either you've inherited several $1 million and you're not managing it properly," Marcus continued, "or you've inherited several $1 million and you don't trust your own family enough to be honest about it. Either way, it's time for some adult supervision." Adult supervision. As if I were a child incapable of managing my own affairs. I knew then that I had to take action to protect both my assets and what remained of my relationship with Sarah. But what I discovered when I started investigating their background and motivations would shock me far more than their demands for money ever could. The research I was about to undertake would reveal that everything I thought I knew about my daughter's marriage, and possibly about my daughter herself, had been carefully constructed. Lies designed to separate me from the inheritance they'd known about all along. That night, after Marcus and Sarah left my house with their unsigned trust documents and obvious frustration at my continued resistance, I made a decision that changed everything. I was going to stop reacting defensively to their pressure and start actively investigating what was really happening. The next morning, I contacted a private investigator recommended by my lawyer. I felt guilty about investigating my own daughter and her husband, but their behavior had become so concerning that I needed to know what I was really dealing with. What the investigator uncovered over the next 2 weeks was far worse than anything I'd imagined. Marcus did indeed work at the investment firm, but his employment record was problematic. He'd been written up twice for inappropriate inquiries into clients' personal financial situations beyond his professional scope. More disturbing, he had significant gambling debts, totaling nearly $60,000 money, owed to both casinos and private individuals, who were becoming increasingly aggressive about collection. The PI discovered that Marcus had been researching my family extensively. He'd contacted Robert's former business associates, trying to get information about the sale of Robert's company and the size of his estate. He'd searched public records for any real estate transactions or large financial movements in my name. He'd even tried to access Robert's obituary and funeral home records, looking for clues about his wealth. But the most shocking discovery was that Marcus's interest in my finances had begun long before he'd even met Sarah. Through social media research and careful questioning, the investigator uncovered that Marcus had specifically sought out Sarah after learning through mutual friends that she was the daughter of Robert Peterson's only surviving relative. Marcus had deliberately targeted my daughter because he'd researched my family and believed we had money. The evidence was all there in digital breadcrumbs. Marcus had friend-requested several of Sarah's college classmates on social media weeks before he'd ever spoken to Sarah herself. He'd asked casual questions about Sarah's family, her background, whether her mum had ever mentioned inheritance money. When those friends mentioned Sarah worked in marketing and that her uncle had been some kind of successful businessman who died and left everything to her mom, Marcus had begun his campaign to meet her. Their entire relationship had been built on Marcus's financial interest in my family. But there was worse news coming. The investigator also discovered that Sarah herself had been more involved than I'd realized. Phone records showed that she'd contacted Robert's estate attorney 3 months after the wedding, claiming she needed information about the inheritance for tax purposes. She'd specifically asked about the total amount of the estate and whether there were any restrictions on how the money could be accessed. My daughter had been researching my inheritance behind my back, using her legal status as family to try to get information she had no right to possess. The final piece of evidence broke my heart completely. The PI had recorded conversations between Sarah and Marcus during their lunch meetings at a restaurant near Sarah's office. In these recordings, they discussed what they called Operation Inheritance, their plan to manipulate me into revealing and sharing the money they were certain I possessed. Their strategy had 3 phases. First, create emotional pressure through fake emergencies and family loyalty appeals. Second, if that didn't work, bring in professional pressure through Marcus's supposed expertise and legal documents giving them financial control. Third, if I continued to resist, they were prepared to have me declared mentally incompetent to manage my own affairs. They had already consulted with an elder law attorney about the process for challenging someone's mental competency when they believe the person is making irrational financial decisions. Sitting in my living room reading through pages of evidence that detailed how my own daughter had conspired to manipulate and potentially legally attack me for money, I experienced a level of betrayal I couldn't have imagined. 28 years of loving, raising, supporting, and sacrificing for Sarah, and she was willing to destroy me for inheritance money she'd never earned. But along with the heartbreak came clarity. I now knew exactly what I was dealing with, and I had evidence of their true intentions. More importantly, I had time to plan my response before they moved to their final phase of legal action against me. I was no longer going to be the victim in this situation. I was going to take control, protect my assets, and teach both Marcus and Sarah a lesson about the real cost of greed and betrayal. What they didn't know was that while they'd been planning Operation Inheritance, I'd been learning exactly who they really were. And I was about to show them that underestimating a small-town librarian with $43 million had been their biggest mistake. The confrontation I was planning would reveal not only the full extent of their deception, but also demonstrate that sometimes the best defense against people who want to control you is to take away everything they think they can control. Armed with the private investigator's evidence and my lawyer's advice, I spent the next week carefully planning my counterattack. My attorney helped me restructure my will and establish an irrevocable trust that would protect the majority of my assets from any future legal challenges. We also prepared documents that would expose Marcus and Sarah's manipulation attempts to relevant authorities, including Marcus's employer and the State Bar Association. But first, I wanted to give them one final opportunity to reveal their true character while I documented everything. I called Sarah and Marcus, telling them I'd been thinking about our previous conversations and was ready to have an honest discussion about my finances. I suggested we meet at a neutral location, a conference room at my lawyer's office, which I presented as a sign that I was taking their concerns seriously. They arrived exactly on time, both dressed professionally and carrying briefcases full of financial planning materials. Sarah hugged me warmly, telling me how proud she was that I was finally ready to be open with my family. Marcus shook my hand and thanked me for trusting them with something so important. Their performances were flawless. "Before we begin," I said, settling into my chair across from them, I want to understand exactly what you both think this conversation is about. Marcus took the lead, explaining that they believed I'd inherited substantial money from Robert and that I needed professional help managing it. He estimated that Robert's estate was probably worth between $2 and $5 million, and he was prepared to provide comprehensive financial planning services to ensure the money was properly invested and protected. We're not asking for anything for ourselves, Marcus emphasized. We're just concerned that money sitting in basic savings accounts isn't working hard enough for your future security. Sarah nodded along, adding that she'd been worried about my retirement plans and wanted to make sure I was taken care of as I got older. I'm grateful for your concern, I said carefully, but I need to ask some specific questions before we go any further. I pulled out a folder containing copies of Marcus's gambling debt records that the PI had uncovered. Marcus, can you explain why someone who's supposedly qualified to manage millions of dollars currently owes nearly $60,000 to various creditors? The color drained from Marcus's face. Sarah looked confused, turning to her husband for an explanation. I don't know what you're talking about, Marcus said, but his voice had lost its confident tone. I placed photocopies of casino statements and collection notices on the table. These documents suggest otherwise. They also suggest that someone with active gambling addiction probably shouldn't be trusted with other people's financial security. Sarah stared at the papers, then at Marcus. What is this, Marcus? What are these bills? Instead of answering Sarah, Marcus turned his attention back to me and the mask finally slipped completely. Where did you get those? You had me investigated. What kind of sick, paranoid old woman has her own son-in-law followed by a private detective? The kind who overhears phone conversations at weddings, I replied calmly. The kind who gets calls from her bank when someone tries to access her accounts without permission. The kind who notices when supposedly laid-off employees are still taking appointments at work. I pulled out transcripts of the recorded conversations the PI had captured. Would you like to hear some excerpts from your lunch meetings? I particularly enjoyed the part where you called this Operation Inheritance and discussed having me declared mentally incompetent if I didn't cooperate. Sarah grabbed the transcripts, scanning them quickly. As she read, her face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, horror, and finally defeat. Sarah, I said gently, I need you to explain to me how you contacted Robert's estate attorney without my knowledge or permission. My daughter's composure cracked completely. She began crying, but these weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of frustration at being caught. Mum, we weren't trying to hurt you, she said through her sobs. We just knew you had money, and we thought you didn't trust us, and it wasn't fair. What wasn't fair exactly? That you had all this money and were pretending to be poor, that you made me feel guilty about asking for help, when you could afford to give us whatever we needed. That you were going to die someday and leave millions to charity or something, instead of taking care of your own family. There it was. Sarah hadn't been manipulated by Marcus into this scheme. She'd been a willing participant, motivated by her own sense of entitlement to money that had never belonged to her. How much did you think I inherited, Sarah? Marcus answered for her. Based on public records of Robert's business sale and his lifestyle before he died, probably anywhere from $10 to $50 million. $50 million. They'd researched thoroughly enough to get very close to the actual amount. And what exactly did you plan to do with this information once you had control of my finances? We were going to help you invest it properly, Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. We were going to make sure you were taken care of. I pulled out the final folder containing copies of Marcus's employment disciplinary records and evidence of his attempts to access client information inappropriately in the past. Were you planning to help me the same way you helped Mrs. Chen, whose retirement account you borrowed from to pay gambling debts? Or maybe like Mr. Rodriguez, whose trust fund somehow got invested in the same high-risk stocks you were personally invested in? Marcus had a history of financial misconduct that his current employer didn't even know about. You're both fired, I said calmly. Fired from any involvement in my financial affairs, fired from any expectation of inheritance. And Sarah, if you don't leave my house key on this table and walk away from this disaster you've created, you're fired from being my daughter. Sarah's sobs became wails. Mum, please, I made a mistake, but I'm still your daughter. You can't just cut me off. Watch me, I said, standing up from the table. You conspired to manipulate, deceive, and potentially legally attack your own mother for money. You married someone who targeted you specifically because he wanted access to wealth he thought your family possessed. You've shown me exactly who you are, and I believe you. I turned to Marcus. You have 48 hours to stay away from my house, my workplace, and any business associated with my name. After that, these documents go to your employer, the State Financial Regulatory Board, and anyone else who might be interested in your professional conduct. As they gathered their materials and prepared to leave, Sarah made one final plea. Mum, what about the money? I'm still your daughter. I still deserve something. I looked at this young woman I'd raised and loved for 28 years, trying to find some trace of the child I'd thought I knew. Sarah, you never asked what I planned to do with Robert's inheritance. You never considered that I might have my own dreams, my own plans, my own right to make decisions about money that belongs to me. You just assumed it would eventually be yours and acted accordingly. But what are you going to do with it all? That, I said, opening the conference room door, is no longer any of your business. The months following that confrontation were the most difficult of my life, but also the most liberating. For the first time in 3 years, I didn't have to pretend to be someone I wasn't, or hide the reality of my financial situation from people who claimed to love me. The immediate aftermath was painful. Sarah tried calling, texting, and even showing up at my house for weeks after our meeting. Her messages alternated between apologies, anger, and attempts at emotional manipulation. She claimed Marcus had pressured her into the whole scheme, that she'd never wanted to hurt me, that family should forgive family no matter what. But the recorded conversations told a different story. Sarah had been just as calculating and greedy as Marcus, just better at hiding it behind daughter guilt and family loyalty. I changed my locks and had a security system installed after finding Marcus lurking around my property one evening. He'd been drinking and became belligerent when I confronted him, demanding to know what I planned to do with all that money, when I was too old and stupid to appreciate it anyway. That encounter convinced me to follow through on my threat to report his professional misconduct. Within 2 months, Marcus had been fired from his investment firm and was facing regulatory review that would likely end his career in financial services. His gambling debts, now public knowledge, made him unemployable in any position requiring financial trust. Sarah divorced Marcus 6 months later. Not out of loyalty to me, but because his career collapse meant he could no longer provide the lifestyle she'd expected. She tried to use the divorce as an opportunity to reconcile with me, claiming she'd been an innocent victim of Marcus's manipulation all along. I declined her attempts at reconciliation. Instead, I focused on building a life that felt authentic to who I was, not who I'd been pretending to be. I quit my job at the library and began traveling, something I'd always wanted to do, but felt I couldn't afford on a librarian's salary. I visited art museums in Europe, took cooking classes in Italy, and spent a month photographing wildlife in Africa. More importantly, I began using Robert's inheritance in ways that honored both his memory and my own values. I established a scholarship fund for first-generation college students in our town. I donated money to expand the library's programs and services. I funded a community centre that provided after-school programs for children whose parents worked multiple jobs. Each charitable decision I made was deeply satisfying in a way that hoarding money had never been. I was using wealth to improve lives and strengthen my community, rather than simply accumulating it or worrying about who might try to take it from me. I also made new friends, people who knew about my financial situation, but valued my friendship for reasons that had nothing to do with money. There's something wonderful about being generous when you know the generosity is appreciated rather than expected or demanded. A year after the confrontation, Sarah made one final attempt to restore our relationship. She'd moved back to Oregon, taken a job with lower pay but better work-life balance, and claimed to have learned important lessons about priorities and family relationships. We met for coffee, and for a brief moment I hoped we might find our way back to some version of mother-daughter love. But when Sarah started talking about her new apartment and how expensive rent had become when she mentioned her student loans and how much easier life would be if she could just pay them off, I realized she hadn't changed at all. She was still looking at me as a source of financial solutions rather than emotional connection. I wished her well, told her I hoped she'd find happiness and success in her new life, and said goodbye. That was 8 months ago, and I haven't heard from her since. Would I change anything about how I handled the situation? I honestly don't know. Part of me wonders if I could have educated Sarah about money and responsibility in a way that might have prevented her choices. Part of me wonders if revealing the inheritance earlier might have led to different outcomes. But mostly, I'm grateful that Marcus and Sarah revealed their true priorities before I made the mistake of trusting them with financial decisions that could have given them control over my life. I learned that money doesn't corrupt people. It reveals who they already are. Sarah and Marcus didn't become greedy and manipulative because of the inheritance. They were already greedy and manipulative people who saw my money as an opportunity to express those existing character traits. I also learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to refuse to enable their worst impulses. By not giving Sarah access to unearned wealth, I forced her to develop her own resources and make her own choices about what kind of person she wanted to become. And I learned that true wealth isn't having $43 million in the bank, although that certainly provides security and options. True wealth is having relationships built on genuine affection rather than financial expectation. Having the freedom to be generous without being exploited, and having the confidence that comes from knowing people value you for who you are, rather than what you can provide. I still have that $43 million, and Sarah still doesn't know the exact amount. Maybe someday we'll get to a place where that doesn't matter anymore, where we can rebuild some kind of relationship based on mutual respect rather than financial dependency. Until then, I'm learning that the richest thing I own isn't in any bank account. It's the peace of mind that comes from knowing the people in my life now choose to be there because they genuinely want to be, not because they're calculating what they might eventually gain. What would you do if you discovered your family was only interested in your money? Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and protecting yourself from people who claim to love you? Let me know in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe for more real-life stories about family money and the complicated relationships between the two. Share this with someone who might need to hear that it's okay to protect yourself, even from people who are supposed to love you unconditionally. Thank you for listening to my story. And remember that your worth isn't measured by what others can gain from you, but by the authentic love and respect you both give and receive.